Okay, welcome to the Indigenous Cartographies and Counter Mapping session. We're glad you're here. We've got an exciting, it's very exciting to me, presentation. Just for the participants, you'll be on mute, but please use the chat for any Zoom-related technical questions and use the Q&A for questions to our presenters. And I will keep posting other links and such in the chat, so keep an eye on that. And Albert is our moderator, and I will let him take it from here. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. And again, thank you, Juliann, for helping with the panel. So yes, this is the Indigenous Cartographies and Counter Mapping panel. And I believe this panel will be able to provide us with a critical perspective into how we all can be better mappers that pay attention to the too often unequal power dynamics of mapping. I would like to now introduce the panelists today that are joining us to share their insights. Maylei Blackwell, Cherokee, draws on 20 years of research accompanying Indigenous women's organizing in Mexico and its diaspora. She teaches in Chicana and Chicano studies and gender studies, and is affiliated faculty in the American Indian Studies at the University of California, Los Angeles. Juliann Anesi, Samoan, is an assistant professor at gender studies at UCLA. Her research interests include disability and indigeneity, educational policies, and decolonial feminisms. As a community educator and activist, she's also worked with nonprofit organizations and schools in America Samoa, California, Hawaii, New York, and Samoa. Dr. Brenda Nicolas is assistant professor in Chicano and Latino studies at Loyola Marymount University, Los Angeles. She looks at women's and children of migrants' participation in community, social, cultural, and political organizing that contests the logics of settler, colonial, and indigenous erasure. And finally, we have Michelle Vasquez Ruiz, also Zapotec. She's a PhD candidate in the Department of American Studies and the in the Department of American Studies and Ethnicity at the University of Southern California. She is a USC Mellon Humanities faculty in the digital world. Oh, sorry. She is a USC Mellon Humanities and a Digital World PhD fellow. Her research considers the way that Indigenous populations in Los Angeles have historically navigated spatial and racial inequalities in the city. So thank you very much for joining us, everybody. And please feel free to take it away. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Albert. So I'm Maylei, and I want to acknowledge we're on Tongva territory, unceded territory, that UCLA is a land grab university, and so our research and our presence and our study have benefited from that relationship and acknowledging the caretakers of Tongva territory, Tongva land, and future generations, past, present, and emerging. I want to share a presentation. Let's see, how can I do this really quick? Talking and zooming at the same time. I want to share, stop sharing screens other. I think you have to stop sharing so I can share, or let me just, thank you. Let's see, where did it go? So I'll share my screen to just frame a little bit about Mapping Indigenous LA and how we came to the project. And then I'm really excited to be able to share all the different contributors who are here with us today. Okay, here's our actual PowerPoint. And you think I would be an expert at this since I do this all the time teaching? Here we go. So yeah, let's see. This is not the one I usually use. So let me just see if I can present. Anyone? Here we go. Here we go. So thank you for this opportunity to present at the UC GIS week. We're excited to share our Mapping Indigenous LA project, which I am a co-founder and one of the co-PIs with Mashana Goman and Wendy Teeter. So it's been a wonderful collaboration between many communities across LA, Indigenous communities, Indigenous story map, mapping stories, and yeah, with community members and multiple research teams, like 15, perhaps more than a dozen. So we're going to share a little bit about some of our research. Of course, as much as this is a mapping project, it's an unmapping project. We're trying to unmap some of the settler and colonial maps that have come to situate Los Angeles, and to try to offer a base map. So with Mapping Indigenous LA, I wrote, the first grants and invited Wendy and Mashana to collaborate along with our colleague Keith Camacho. And we began by thinking about first working with the Tongva community and planning with them what they wanted to see in a project such as this. So we built from the ground up with Tongva community educators. Our first planning phase with that was at Curvagna Springs. And this is Mashana's daughter, Sedona, who's been an important part of the project, and some of the high school students that we worked with working with Tongva Springs and bringing in Zapotec and Mixtec activists from LA initially into the conversation and building from there. So we spent more than a year planning and working with Tongva elders and Tongva community members, and then building out the maps and building our prototype. This is our story map. It's a screenshot. So it's the idea that Los Angeles, even before, when we wrote the grant, New York was considered the biggest population of American Indian folks in the US. And so we wanted to rewrite that by rewriting the map. If we consider all those from the diaspora from Oceania and the Latin American Indigenous diaspora, relocated American Indians, and California Indigenous people, Tongva, Tataviam, all the people in Los Angeles Basin and islands. Los Angeles is the largest population of Indigenous people. So we wanted to unsettle the colonial maps and unmap the way that Indigenous histories and communities had been erased. And the first priority was then to work with Tongva community educators on building Tongva map. There's also a Tataviam map. And so this was part of the process. I'm going to share a little bit about some of the maps I've worked on and then invite our collaborators. So I'm just going to kind of give an overview of some of the processes of using ArcGIS and invite Brenda Nicolas, who's going to speak about working on the Latin American Indigenous diaspora map, but also has a publication coming out with some of our other researchers on the project on using ArcGIS. So some of the considerations that we first grappled with were trying to literally put Indigenous communities on a map, on the map, and that some people didn't want to be mapped, right? There's some sacred sites, there's some community gathering places that we didn't want people just to be able to roll by on. So we really considered and had a community-led mapping, right? So people talk about the idea of thick mapping, as Todd Presner calls it. And so we wanted to have the thick map of the ideas of sense of place and, the way people know LA, but we also wanted to strip away some of those layers in order to let Tongva community histories, be known first and foremost. Then from there, we started to build out many other, we had educational map that Mashana helped lead with students and educational scholars. And we then worked on a large scale collaboration. So some of the maps are narrative. Some of the maps are, their narrative and their spatial, and then some use, Indigenous art, they use Indigenous placemaking, Indigenous ways of spatializing. The Latin American Indigenous map, we tried to use actual mapping.
Can you scroll to the image and do PowerPoint view? People can't see the images that you're talking about.
Oh, I'm wondering if it's this.
Okay, yes.
I think because we uploaded the PowerPoint to be able to share, and when I put the view to watch, it's not coming down. So Oh boy. So I was talking about this as our base map, Tongva base map. This is our first year of collaboration. Hopefully, can you see that, Brenda?
I can't see it. I don't think anyone else can.
Cannot.
No, it looks like that window is closed.
Mhm.
Okay, well, let me download it and then reopen it so people can see it. So hang on just 1 second. Thank you for letting me know. And maybe while I work on this, maybe Brenda, do you want to start? And then I'll get us going and reshare in a second. If you could share a little bit about your experience,
Yes. I'll
you know,
do
the
that.
Latin American Indigenous.
Let's see if I can share my screen.
Okay, here it comes right now. Brenda, I'm
Okay.
gonna share again.
Go ahead, Minnie.
Okay. Okay. So how's that?
Perfect.
Okay.
Or yeah.
So yeah, this was what I was referring to as our working with the idea of mapping, but also unmapping the way we know spatial constructs in LA and trying to help lay out an indigenous Tongva Tataviam base map. We used a collaboration. We began the project and designed it with Tongva elders. This is what I was talking about. This is the image that goes with it. And then the idea of Los Angeles being the largest indigenous population if we count all the different indigenous diasporas in LA. So hopefully that's working out. And then I'll get you to the Latin American Indigenous Diaspora map here, which Brenda and I collaborated, I think, with about 15 different researchers from both the Mayan and Zapotec and Mixtec communities. So I'm turning it over to you now, Brenda.
Oh, sorry, there's one more comment about, can you make the presentation full screen? Sorry, Maylei.
Yeah, I can, but then when I'm, well, check it out and see. How's that?
Perfect.
Thank you.
Sorry, we should have used Keynote. That's what I teach in, and so, but we wanted to share. We shared the slides back and forth online. So this is how we're coming back to this. Thanks.
Okay. Hi, everyone. So I'm going to go ahead and talk a little bit about the LADA map and how that pretty much initiated with community organizers and also indigenous scholars. Maylei pretty much mentioned Lourdes Alberto, who contributed to this map of Oaxacan basketball at Normandy Park. So when I jumped in, it was pretty much to set everything up in terms of how to collaborate better in terms of using GIS for the Latin American Indigenous Diaspora component of MILA, or Mapping Indigenous LA. And so what we have here, for example, right, and I think I can kind of speak more in just generally in terms of how the communities themselves decided to, more technical stuff, but how they decided to pick their own images, go through the archives of their families and put that right to, for example, display their map. At the same time, there were the ones that, for example, this map, which Dr. Lourdes Alberto designed, she also, right, so along with they go the story of how the Oaxacan basketball started at Normandy Park. Professor Lourdes Alberto, that is from the Sierra Juarez, she's Zapotec, which is also where I'm from. In the Sierra Juarez, I'm from San Jerónimo Suchina and Yasachilalto. But this is pretty much how a lot of Serranos, Zapotecs organized here in Los Angeles in the 80s and the 90s, and as early as the 1970s here, as it's mentioned here, right? And so this, for example, is tied to, I can't move it, huh? Is tied to the other images, to chapters, to number 7, and to number 5, which pretty much kind of traces this history of how Zapotecs began organizing in Normandy Park here in Los Angeles, California. And so right, was the intention here for the map was to pinpoint exactly the historical presence, past presence, and pretty much emergence of how Zapotecs have organized throughout, or Serrano Zapotecs have organized throughout this area. I do want to mention that, at least for the part that I did, I looked more at the indigenous Oaxacan diaspora from the Valles Centrales, or the central valleys of Oaxaca. And I kind of, yeah. And so can I share my screen, maybe?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And so kind of, I guess to, right, kind of put a framework as to what we're looking at when we talk about Oaxaca. So Oaxaca is right composed of 8 regions in Mexico. It's situated in the southern Mexico, and the area that we specifically looked at for the Latin American Indigenous diaspora map was the Sierra Norte diaspora here in LA, and the Zapotec diaspora from the Valles Centrales, right? So the Sierra Norte diaspora concentrates more than anything in 3 areas in LA, which is Koreatown, Mid-City, and South Central LA. And for the Zapotecos from the Valles Centrales, they concentrate here in LA in the West Los Angeles area, Santa Monica, Marina del Rey, and more towards parts of Hollywood or East Hollywood. So let me share now the other map. This is a little bit tricky because I'm also using a new mouse and I'm not used to it. But right, so what we started is, so in the Latin America, this is the Latin American Indigenous diaspora part of the map. And so we have 16 maps that locates not only the Maya diaspora from Guatemala, Canjobal, Quiche, right, that a lot of collaborators participated in.
We should also say our new colleague at UCLA, Floridama Bosch Lopez,
Yes.
who's a new faculty member in Chicana, Chicano and Central American Studies, has now joined our faculty. She was one of the collaborators.
For sure. So Flori Bosch Lopez is located here with the Comunidad Shin, right? That organizes, it's a youth organizing group. And so they map themselves in downtown LA, right? But I think the map just, the way that I came into it and why the reasons that I did come into it to participate, not only was because Dr. Maylei Blackwell welcomed me, and so did Mashana Goldman and Wendy Teeter, but it was also because it was very community-based, community-centered. And so it was about speaking and having the Indigenous peoples themselves, you know, be the voice of this presentation and how they wanted to, what exactly they wanted to pinpoint, right? And how, and so that's why I think I, you know, was really, I decided to help out, right, in designing or helping publish this part of the Mila map. So we have, right, different traditions of how Indigenous Guatemalans or Mayas make continue, right, with their practices in terms of identity and belonging, not necessarily belonging to here the US or to Los Angeles, because I think oftentimes when we look at migration, or at least Indigenous Oaxacan migration, we've always kind of still leaned towards this like belonging to the US, but without really realizing what the logics of that within settler colonialism is, right? That a lot of us are still very connected to back home, right, to our pueblos, to Oaxaca, to, you know, participating in many ways with the pueblos that our parents are born and raised. Many of us participated, as we can see here in these maps, right, with the Guelaguetza. And so, for example, for my community, which is also mapped here, that Janet Romero, I believe is her last name, Martinez. Yes, Janet Martinez, who is Zapotec from the community of San Bartolomé Sogocho in the Sierra Juarez, mapped out map 14, 15, and 16. And so in a way, right, this also kind of speaks to like the initiatives that as Indigenous scholars that we took in, you know, making this presence known, right? The Centro Educativo Benito Juarez, for example, for me was, I was part of that when I was growing up, right? And so this is an initiative done by the first, second, and 1.5 generation Oaxaqueños in LA that pretty much was the beginning of many of us kind of knowing, getting tutored, right? Getting tutored by these Indigenous, the children of Indigenous migrants in the early 1990s when we still met in the garage of Abigail's grandmother. This is my community, for example, and it just highlights the difference within Zapotecs and what they're doing, such as William Martinez, who's a counselor now at Santa Monica College, DJ Survive, and how he connects his music, right, and plays, you know, Oaxacan DJing within hip hop and other types of urban music into the whole right identity of his, of knowing where he's from, right, and kind of not only bringing that side of it, but also how he continues to dance within his community that highlights this indigeneity, right? And or this movement of indigeneities among Zapotecos in LA. I think that's it. I just want to make sure everybody has enough time to talk.
Thanks. And we want to also mention our collaborator, Gaspar Rivera Salgado, I think who's also with us on in Zoom reality here, as one of the major collaborators with us on this Latin American Indigenous diaspora map. So it was a pretty large team of collaborators. And I'll share a follow-up of some of the work. So Brenda and I worked on coordinating that large scale map. And we worked a lot, Gaspar's featured right here on the left. But we wanted to share also that Michelle worked on starting to collaborate on a language map that we tried to do in collaboration with the Tlatilocos Downtown Central Library exhibition, and they're from the Valles Centrales that Brenda talked about. And they, you know, even here and they respatialize LA, right? And in relationship to Little Tlacalula, their hometown in LA, Culver City, Santa Monica. So they're respatializing here. So we did a language map. So we wanted to share some of the maps that are in progress that aren't up yet because there's such long collaboration. So one of the first maps we started was the Crossroads and Currents maps. These are the sites we've interviewed folks and been walking with lots of community activists and knowledge holders. This is Grandma Gloria Arianes, one of the Tongva elders who, you know, worked with the Ancestor Walk and many different organizations here in Los Angeles. And so these are some of the interviews. And I'm going to turn it over to Michelle to talk about this. So Michelle is one of the newer research assistants that came onto the project. And I think the challenge of this spatializing is it's not just one community, but we're trying to show how different Indigenous communities intersect in terms of land and water and community.
So hi, everyone. You know, I don't know if it's more nerve-wracking to be in person or to do it through Zoom. If I'm a little nervous, I'm sorry about that. But yes, as Maylei mentioned, I'm a newer researcher for the team. And just a little bit about myself, I joined the team back in 2017, I believe. And I was just really drawn to this particular project, or drawn to Mila itself. And what I found really interesting, yes, I found exciting the idea of mapping Indigenous people in LA, right? This was a moment where I was like, I feel seen. And finally, you know, someone has recognized the existence of my community, as Brenda has pointed out, in LA. And so I'm particularly fascinated by the idea of understanding LA as a layered city, as a city that is layered with different Indigenous spatial knowledges, right? And so as we've already seen throughout this presentation already, there are multiple Indigenous communities that, you know, reside in LA for different reasons. And so this cross-cultural, or this crossroads and cross-currents map that I'm presenting, as mentioned by Dr. Blackwell, is a project that's still in development. But this project is tasked with understanding and further exploring how the arrival of different Indigenous communities, how these communities have intersected with each other, and how they've intersected with the first peoples of LA, with Tongva and Tataviam communities. And so, you know, just knowing the city, just knowing LA, knowing it as this very tight and kind of cramped space, we can't imagine that these Indigenous populations that live throughout the city live in a vacuum, right? It's impossible to imagine that these communities have never intersected with each other, have never met. Of course they have. Of course there have been moments in which they've come together, in which they've formed relationships, in which perhaps there have been tensions. But the point of this map is to be able to meet, to find these places and to think about, how do we map out relationships? How do we map out these moments of intersection, of them intertwining? And so as a map that's still in development, I'm excited to hear any suggestions or thoughts that people might have during the Q&A on how do we map relationships? How do we visualize these kinds of connections? And so one of our approaches in thinking about these intersections is relying on oral histories or interviews with participants, right? Of privileging their voices and perspectives of the people who have formed and created these relationships. And so on the screen, you can see a quick list of some of the places or events in which we know or we can imagine there have been moments of intersection or collaboration between different Indigenous communities. Of course, you know, I don't have all day, but if I did, I would. I can't talk about every single one. But today I want to just highlight just 2 interviews that I was able to conduct for this map so far. And so if we can switch over to the next slide, one of the interviews that I helped conduct was with Patricia Borjon Lopez, who is a Tiwa Pueblo activist. In the 1960s, she was a photographer for La Raza magazine during the Chicano movement. As a photographer, she helped create an extensive archive of photographs that depicted the various protest movements during the Chicano movement, during the Chicano student walkouts, anti-war protests of the 1960s and 70s, and of course, the heavy surveillance and police brutality that pushed against their activism. Her work attentively captured the cross-cultural collaborations that propelled these movements for equality and justice. As she explains in the interview, Native American activists and organizations such as the American Indian Movement, or AIM, participated in various actions alongside Chicanx activists. These collaborations often led to many activists to rediscover and strengthen their Indigenous identities. And so for me, conducting this interview with Ms. Lopez was incredibly insightful and mind-blowing, right? As someone that got her BA in Chicano Studies, I was incredibly shooketh. I was impacted by the idea that these movements could not have happened without the collaboration of Native American activists. And so parts of these histories get sometimes left out of the narrative. And so one of the things that particularly struck me was her photography or her activism during the Chicano student walkouts, right? For those of you that don't know, in 1968, Chicano student youth walked out of their high schools across East LA, demanding to have more culturally competent education. And so I think about Pat, and I think about all the Native activists that participated and recorded and helped during these movements. And I think about how these historical moments in LA could not have been possible without the collaboration and intersection of Native American populations. And so I think about how the movement how this movement has impacted the trajectory of LA, the trajectory of education in the city and across the nation, right? As something that was birthed by these moments of collaboration. And so to follow up, another interview that I did a little later on was with Marcos Aguilar, who is the director of Semillas del Pueblo, which is a a K-12 international baccalaureate school in El Sereno. And so this school offers its students as a part of this legacy that, you know, is interested in the cultural backgrounds of its students. It provides Nahuatl education, it provides Nahuatl and Spanish instruction, as well as Danza Azteca, as well as indigenously based math courses. They're very close, they emphasize the importance of preserving indigeneity for Nahuatl communities and for other indigenous communities that might attend this school. And so one of the things that I found really interesting in my interview with Marcos is how annually his high school students host an international Indigenous Youth Leadership Summit, in which they invite different tribal nations and tribal youths to come to LA, to come to their school and to have conversation, right? To just get to know each other, to talk. And so in the process of doing so, these youths are able to meet and are able to find commonalities and are able to find things that issues that they both similarly experience and would both similarly like to address. And so out of these moments of collaboration and meeting between different tribal youths, they have actually organized themselves and have attended the United Nations Forum of the UN's Permanent Forum on Indigenous Movement or Indigenous Issues. And so these youths have actually addressed the UN and discussed educational issues for Indigenous youth, environmental concerns, and other things that affect Indigenous communities. And so I think about how these moments of collaboration don't just create, you know, movement within LA, don't just create movement within the country, but are also affecting the trajectory of the world, right? these moments of collaboration, these moments of change couldn't be possible without the collaboration of Indigenous peoples in the city. And so for me, that's why mapping matters. And so, I'm tasked with the idea of having to map out some of these relationships. And so if anyone would like to talk or give me suggestions on how we can move forward and visualize these things, I'd be excited to talk about it.
Thanks, Michelle. So I just want to make sure we have time to let Juliann present. So the Crossroads map, these are the actual sites that have already been researched. And then if we have time, I'll talk about my work on the Two-Spirit map. So I've also worked on the Crossroads and the Latin American Indigenous map, but I want to turn it over to make sure we have time to talk about the Pacific Islander map. Michelle and I worked for about a year with EPIC to try to set up a community collaborative relationship, and Juliann has been working on that. So it'll be so great to hear from her. Thank you.
Great. So hi, everybody. Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Brenda. Thank you, Maylei, for setting us off. Hi, everybody. I'm Juliann. So this has been, as you've probably gathered by now, a lot of moving parts that are happening, a lot of collaborators, a lot of communities. And it's just been a lot of work to just kind of keep track of. So in 2012, or I'm sorry, not 2012, 2017, I think, or 18, I came on board for the MILA Pacific Islanders story maps. And so part of our collaboration, as Maylei just mentioned, was that we were trying to collaborate with a community organization. And so this community organization was a local one in LA called EPIC, and that stands for Empowering Pacific Island Communities. And so what we tried to do was to work with them in collaboration to the story maps. So at the time, EPIC was also engaging with the US Census, the 2020 census. And so this was a big part of our work. And so how we work together to organize the story maps. And so I think what I wanna start with is that, the Pacific Islands, and if you can just please share that map, or I can probably just share real quick a map of the Pacific. And the Pacific Islands is a huge place. I mean, as my colleagues have mentioned, it's hard to represent all these different spaces. So specifically, my family is from Samoa, which is right here in the sort of middle of Polynesia. But as you can see, the vast area of islands, ethnicities, groups, religious groups, political affiliation, etc. So it was really a huge task to try to represent all these different groups. So this is part of our work. Why we ended up working with the census was we figured we can try to narrow it down to maybe the largest groups of Pacific Islanders here in the LA Basin. And so that's how we sort of organize this. And so I think what I want to share with you today is just sort of the brief process of our kind of organizing of these maps. And just to reiterate, these are in progress. Unfortunately, COVID has put a wrench in all of our lives. So what we intended to do is still in progress. And so that's where we're at. So part of the census, has also been another factor of this, is trying to bring our communities to fill out the census, but then COVID hit. So we sort of had to pivot as a team to kind of deal with COVID as well. But just to give you data on Pacific Islanders in LA, the three largest groups of Pacific Islanders are Native Hawaiians, Samoans, and Tongans. And then that's followed by Chamorro and other island groups as Fijian and Marshallese and Micronesian. So what we decided to do was to work with the local organizations in LA who very much have been doing this work of working with our elders and our communities forever. So a lot of the migration to the LA started in the 1950s. I think we interviewed one elder who came here in 1952, and he came here via US military, and others have also come to LA in terms of religious or church affiliation, but mostly jobs and affiliation with the military is what sort of brought many of these communities in LA. So we highlighted about 5 or 8 elders from these various communities that I mentioned, and we set up interviews with them. Many of them have been working in the census since the 1970s. So we really try to just follow that roadmap that they already set up, was how a lot of them set up sort of structures and institutions on how Pacific Island communities can fill out the census and also vote. So it was sort of these moving parts of the work that they were doing. So for us with Mila, we try to not sort of replicate this work, but also just to follow the community's lead on what they were doing already. And so the census, I think, was a huge part of this. And that's where we went. So in terms of interviews, I don't have any more slides, by the way, so thank you, Jillian. So part of the interviews that we set up were with 5 elders from the Samoan community, Tongan community, Native Hawaiian, and then the Chamorro community. So, so these elders talked a lot about how many of them sort of their migration story of how they ended up here in LA. And we also interviewed them about what do they think about their position as Pacific Islanders, but also as sort of visitors to this place. So we really tried to also think about, the Tongva community and the Indigenous community that are here, and kind of make those connections with their position here in LA per se, and what their relations is to the Indigenous folks here. So that's been kind of our to-do list, and kind of our objective with also just working with our various Pacific Island communities. And things have been shifting. So with COVID, we've had to sort of pause our interviews and our oral history and our talk story sessions, Talanoa sessions, and shift over to thinking about having churches open COVID testing sites there. We've been dealing a lot with food insecurity, as well as folks being evicted from their homes. So, this project has also springboarded to many other things, which I think Brenda, Michelle, Maylei, and myself have talked about, is that Mila isn't just this sort of counter mapping project. It has also been a springboard to many other issues in our communities, but also the beauty that comes out of these collaborations have been sort of the long-term work that we hope to keep doing. And I think before I end, I just want to give a shout out that I think there's a new curriculum on our Mila website. So if you're interested in kind of teaching some of these topics and themes that we shared, Mila on the website has a curriculum for folks to use. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Juliann. So that was a Tongva community workshop that we partnered with 3rd and 4th grade teachers in LA. So those materials are being launched. So we wanted to that was actually perfect timing, Juliann. You're amazing. So as you can see, there's multiple maps and multiple projects. I'll just put up the Two-Spirit map quickly, just so we don't. So, some of the maps were based on different communities, different diasporas, and then some are like the kinds of communities that are made in the crossroads between different forms of indigenous diasporas and those who are native to Los Angeles. So this Two-Spirit map, I've been working on it maybe 4 years. So it has interviews with El Frank Manriquez, a Tongva Achaman artist, Red Circle Project founder Elton Naswood, who's on the bottom there, as well as other folks who have worked with Red Circle Project, Yue Begay and Michelle as well. The City of Angels Two-Spirit Society, which I'm a founding member, Hudson Tibbetts and Gabriel Estrada. On the top is pictured Miss Trans World and Terry J. And Terry J transformed, like trans pageantry by insisting that people not run as Miss California or Miss so-and-so, but ran as Miss Navajo Nation. And so many other Native women trans Native women began to also compete as, Miss, I don't know, Cherokee Nation, Miss, there's been a White Earth Apache. So, and then we also interviewed folks who were part of the Vela Mouche. Zapotecs have a third gender category. And so the members of the Vela Mouche, participated in mapping, like where do they, where do people meet? How do we rewrite the map in terms of those who are marginalized even within marginal indigenous cultures? So we'll stop there. We have similar issues, food insecurity, COVID, but I want to invite my co-presenters to join on screen so we could do some questions and answers.
Yep, thank you everybody. That was very helpful in terms of how we can move forward with respecting all forms of mapping, especially that from what's typically not really heard on and made public. So there hasn't been any Q&A questions. Please feel free to chime in, but I do have a couple that I was thinking about. So one is, any advice that we can hear as mappers to help support these efforts to decolonize, mapping in day-to-day? So Maylei, you kind of mentioned that we have the Miss World and Miss Trans, and she kind of put that in her, in their realm. So
definitely a she.
She, sorry.
Hey,
sorry.
yes.
Sorry. But yeah, so is there any other advice that you can give to kind of put these efforts in just day-to-day considerations and mapping?
Yeah. Well, I think, there's lots of things we could do. We've worked really closely with our colleague Mashana Goman, whose work has been really important in mapping. But we also listen to the community. So what Tongva community educators say about the land, the borders of the land, the borders of communities, which are colonial borders. So, thinking and taking serious that part of our work as guests on their territory is to understand how they see, the land base, building our relationship to our relatives, the land and caretaking, but also, decolonizing geography and ArcGIS. ArcGIS has been a tool, not just, geography in the historic sense of colonialism, but contemporary in terms of indigenous communities in Latin America. It's a tool of dispossession, right? People have used ArcGIS to displace people from their lands, to have extractivist projects, right? So knowing that ArcGIS is used for indigenous dispossession and part of, indigenous genocide, I think is really important. I think some people geographers were like, but how do you know that's this coordinate or that coordinate? I think we have to be open to indigenous cosmologies, epistemologies. One of the things we really struggled with is, the linear mapping that lots of Pacific Islander communities mapped towards the stars, and our maps towards the earth, that we're using ArcGIS is limited in the sense I mean, at first we were going kind of crazy. We talked with Wendy and Michelle and I were like, we're going to have, you know, artificial intelligence. We were going to have all these things, and we were going to have things georeferenced. So like as you drive through LA, stories would pop up. So, you know, I think it's a multi-front struggle, definitely. And we have to, you know, just keep doing the work and stop, I guess, reinforcing the truth of colonial structures, right? That they're one of many, but relatively recent, right? These forms of spatial knowledge. I'm looking that we're finally getting some questions. Yeah, so are we working with Indigenous map makers and how they represent themselves? So all of the different Indigenous group, all the maps are based on Indigenous collaboration, and all the folks here are Indigenous researchers. And then I think some of the map making, Craig Torres has definitely made maps of how he sees relationality with relatives, plant relatives, the land, etc. I know Cynthia Beatrice worked with a map, collaborated with someone who's done a map as well. I wonder if someone else wants to take on, I see the Two Spirit project, but anyone want to add to Albert's question or Indigenous map making or?
Well, just really quickly to answer Albert's question, I think working with this project, one of the biggest things it's taught me is patience. As Maylei was explaining it, we've been working on these ongoing maps for 4 years, the Two Spirit map and the Crossroads map that I'm working on. We've actually for 4 years, since 2017, right? You know, as a PhD candidate, we're living in a world where I have to produce and be able to say I did something. But I think being a part of this project has taught me patience and working with community, and that takes time, right? Collaborating with people and understanding what things can be mapped and what things couldn't. And I think that's another aspect of mapping that I think I've learned is some things don't need to be mapped, right? Some things are best off just left as it is. And there's some things that need to be placed. And I think patience and how to work with community is one of the most important aspects of this project.
Yeah, I mean, I think for Pacific Island, the Pacific Island story map, I mean, I think we're sort of the newer story map that's being organized as we speak. And I think to kind of bridge to your question around decolonizing, I think we're still at the stage where we have to acknowledge that we are visitors on this land, and our relations to Indigenous folks on these lands is very much similar and parallels our honorifics and our genealogies in the Pacific Islands, right? So, you know, we always acknowledge place and land and people and everything else, living and non-living in those spaces. And so I think this project has really been a sort of a teaching tool as well for our communities, and a reminder maybe, you know, that we are in relations to others here, and there's a long history of colonial history of violence and dispossession that we're dealing with here. And I think we just have to be conscious of that. And I think once that consciousness is in place, then we can kind of move forward with other aspects of, you know, everything that all of us on this panel is trying to do. But I agree with Michelle, patience, you know, we have the saying that island time is forever. Folks know this, that our folks work at their own pace, whether it's linear or spiral or backwards. I mean, all of the above. So
Just,
wow. We have a lot of questions.
Okay, now people are warmed up. So
yeah, awesome.
Pamela's question, the Two Spirit map, yeah, that came out of, I think the idea is that we're not mapping other people, we're mapping ourselves. So the Two Spirit map came out of our Two Spirit collaboration and our CATS, so City of Angel Two Spirit Society. So our sense of places where we gather and where, you know, parks, cruising places, testing places, the salons where the Vela Mouche is, you know, so our forms of community making are a form of placemaking. And then someone's asking, I don't know, Brenda, if you want to jump in, but the idea of unmapping colonial cartography, the comment I made, especially about how do we draw the line about where people, you know, what they want mapped and what they don't want mapped. So we definitely used we community-led knowledge, right? So we didn't put anything that people didn't want on it. We actually, you know, GIS is such spatial specific. Sometimes we had to create like a bubble instead of a pin. So to try to say this general area, right? To kind of mess up a little bit of those colonial constructs. So definitely Indigenous knowledges, you know, were the first priority. So it's a different kind of project that doesn't put the geographic knowledge first, but says geographic knowledge is highly, you know, imbued with colonial relationships. And so it really privileged Indigenous knowledges. I don't know if you're scrolling in the questions, Brenda, I just want to give you a chance to jump in.
Yeah, and I think I'm just looking at some, for example, decolonial scholarship is very contested territory, pun intended, by Carmen Valdivia. There's collaboration between transcolonial epistemologies, but also policing of these borders, mainly in the academy. How do you all negotiate these tensions? I think, you know, I don't know if I could answer that directly or correctly, if there's any correct answer, but what came out for the project when, right, it was usually me and the person that filmed, for those that wanted to be filmed, right? So this is also part of that project, that it wasn't only like writing their story, whatever it is that they decided to put on there, but it was also about, you know, whoever wanted to be recorded, let's just do more of this oral history, as Michelle was talking about, right? And placing the oral history, the visual with the, right, with the verbal to the map, right? And so that was a choice of the collaborators, of the participants, of the community, right? So for example, when we went to interview at the, you know, the Indigenous Oaxacans in the West Side, we always talked about the collaboration between, right, the Native people of Maylei, Tamba, Tatavian, Gabrielinos, so forth and so on. And so it was very interesting to hear, right, what Maylei mentioned earlier. It was always like, wait, they exist, or are they still here? Or, you know, and it was just kind of talking about that relationship and that continual the presence of Native people here still in LA, right? And so I think that's exactly what the project does. So for example, right, when the project came out, when it was published for Mila, a lot of these, so I sent the link to, via email to the people that participated, or via their social media, whether it was an organization, right? Usually a lot of these folks also represent some type of organization within their community. And so it gave them a better sense, and also an amplification of how Indigenous peoples, guests or Native, can begin to establish some type of relationship or just knowledge, right, of each other. Right, a lot of it imposed of not knowing each other's experience through these colonial structures of education, right? And what, not essentializing what Mila can do or GIS can do, but in essence, how the community responds to it, right? And what they, how it can collaborate different Indigenous peoples within one, right? For example, Southern California. And I think, for example, right, what Maylei Blackwell talks about in the multiple colonialities, right? This idea that how we all come to, you know, experience different colonialities, Spanish, English, so forth and so on, is still present, right? But how we negotiate that through the different stories that we're hearing and that we read in Mila. And with that, this idea that also Mishana Goldman brings of settler colonial grammar of place, right? Or settler grammar, right? So for example, my own work as a Zapotec, right, from the Sierra Juarez, born and raised in LA, right, how I actually don't really like to use the Baja California term, because it helps for a lot of Indigenous Oaxacans that have been racialized and discriminated by other non-Indigenous Mexicans and Latinos. But at the same time, what does it do when we kind of like put a different name to something that's already native, right, and has its own name? And so it's slippery, and I'm still kind of like thinking through that. But these are the new ideas, I think, that are emerging, and that how it shows, right, this collaboration between different Indigenous groups arriving to Native in LA, at least.
I think actually that's why we, even in the first place, embarked on this endeavor. It started like I think I wrote the first grant in 2011. So it's, you know, a long collaboration, but I think getting to Carmen's transcolonial points is that, yeah, I mean, LA is a multiple colonialities, multiple layers of settler geographies built on Spanish and Mexican colonial geography. So we were trying to unlayer and undo the different colonial mappings, right? That name the ranchos, etc. And speaking to Bruce's point too, yep, we center and we center and we prioritize as an ethical commitment Indigenous knowledge. So communities say this is where their villages are, and they know a lot that's, you know, anthropologists and archaeologists don't. So yeah, we centered them in their map making, and that is their map. That's not one of our maps, the first map in the presentation that was featured from a cultural center. So yeah, and future maps, I think we're like, we got to finish the ones, we've been working to finish the ones we have. I know it's also balancing, you know, the population boom of like Zapotecs per se. Like the Zapotec community wanted a culinary map, and they wanted a band map of all their, you know, the different Philharmonic bands from different hometown associations. They wanted many more maps, and we were like, wait, we got to finish, make sure other communities have some space and time to finish their work. Yeah, the Pacific Islander map, we had to you know, to come back, and Juliann was so helpful. But you know, it's a cultivating relationships that takes a really long time. What we didn't mention about the Pacific Islander map and some of the other maps is that students also have been participating, and that's been really fun. They went to Carson, and you know, it's like the Pacific Islander map shifts us towards the South Bay too, in a way we hadn't done, but the students have been also interviewing elders and trying to make video montages and getting into their own kinds of trouble with that. So our map has been community-based with us as researchers and with students, and Michelle did a lot of working with the students.
There was another question. This came in from Ari.
Oh, I didn't scroll. Okay.
So go ahead.
Juliann, do you want to take this one?
So her
Sure,
question.
thank you, Ari.
Go ahead.
Oh, sorry, go ahead, Albert. Did you want to?
No, go ahead.
As I read. So I guess the question is, how do we as academics make mapping tools accessible so as to best serve the communities who need it the most? And I think this is in lieu to thinking about, you know, sea level rising and climate change. Absolutely. I mean, I think what we're learning, our team of students, what we're learning, students and researchers, community folks, you know, we're all learning here. And I think the word mapping, I think also can be a category of an analytical category, you know, whether it's mapping through, you know, physical space, spiritual space, or, you know, our long histories of, you know, mythologies, myths, stories, oral histories, etc. So I think that sort of get-go is kind of a starting point to think about mapping in those ways, that there's multiple definitions, but it's ultimately how our communities define it, right? And that's a hard, I think, to kind of shift and pivot to those leads. You know, in terms of Pacific Islands, I mean, we know climate change has already affected many communities in the Pacific. We've already have certain islands who are currently underwater. We have, you know, the new term of ecological refugees now, you know, thinking about specific islands like in Tuvalu, which is one of the islands, has already, you know, many of its communities have already moved off because of the rising water. And so, you know, I mean, these are all sort of pressing issues that I don't think our mappings can solve all at once. So I think that's also really important. I think that we have to sort of be practical about what we can do. You know, and I'm saying this because this is in progress, right? That, you know, mapping is a tool, and I think tools can be disseminated, but it can also be interpreted and used in various ways. And I think to kind of go back to the point, it's our communities who kind of lead us into this. So, which is why we can't underscore enough why this has been such a challenging, but also, you know, exciting project at the same time.
Thank you. There's a final
Yep.
question about the language map, and I know we're over time, so I'll just say that it was methodologically very challenging. We did it with Gaspar Rivera Salgado, a mixed text scholar here at UCLA, and with another Zapotec scholar, Sochi led it. And it was challenging because we did it at community groups. Michelle worked on it, the survey, and what we realize is that because people cluster at community groups in their hometown formations, then we would get tons of people from one hometown and not another. So we had to kind of go back to the drawing board and thinking about that. But I want to say that some of our community collaborators were so like we were taking too long, and it's a big negotiation between all the team members, which maps get done and the resources, et cetera. So there's been a, Gaspar Rivera Salgado did a hometown association map, a really beautiful one. And also the organization Cielo, Comunidades Indigenous in Liderazgo has done their own language map. So please check out cielo.org. And they've done a map based on their COVID response, right? So just as Juliann was saying, what's happening with COVID is shaping this. They're also in response. So cielo.org has a new map that I highly recommend people check out. Thank you, everyone.
Well, thank you very much. Sorry, I mean, yeah, I know we went a little bit over, but I think these are very important topics to really understand. And I just want to thank you, Maylei, Juliann, Brenda, and Michelle. It's very helpful. And I hope that in the future, you mentioned that, you know, mapping is continuous. And I think it's the idea of thick mapping that, you know, things are always changing. And I hope that in the Slack, you can provide a resource for us to keep collaborating. And I know guerrilla cartography is one thing that happens from time to time that people can get involved in. And if any last words about, like, you know, if people want to stay connected, or if people want to, you know, just help with this effort, is there any way to do so?
So our email is mappingindigenousla, all lowercase, @gmail.com. And we also have a Facebook, which is just Mapping Indigenous LA. We haven't gone all Twitter and Insta yet, but that is our social media presence and our Gmail. So yeah, please let us know what you're thinking.
All right, thank you so much again for your time. And thank you everybody for tuning in and having your questions in the chat. And I hope you enjoy how we can keep continuing the counter mapping.
Thank you.
Yep. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this inspiring talk, guys. It was wonderful.
Yep.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.